So do you remember last week, Cam, when I was complaining about how I never have a good opener for the podcast because I don't have anything interesting going on in my life? And
yes, I do.
All I do is work, podcast, and be married to you. You know, not very exciting, right?
In that order of enjoyment?
Yeah. I regret that now because yesterday I had something very interesting happen to me. And by interesting, I mean not fun at all, and it was terrible.
Do you mean good? Like a career opportunity? A great dish?
No.
Did you find a new pair of shoes?
No, it was none of that. In fact, I was attacked by an animal. And I know that sounds dramatic, but that's what happened yesterday.
I'm looking at the bruises. It's pretty dramatic.
Yesterday, I won't get into the specifics because it doesn't matter, but my grandmother owns this dog who is very protective of her, and he doesn't like other people. And by other people, I mean me. I went to pick her up.
Any other people, right?
Yes. He likes my grandpa, okay, but Grandpa wasn't there. I went to go pick my grandma up, and the dog escaped and bit me right on the leg. It was bad. I'm okay. It's fine. He's up to date on his shots. We're okay. But it was not fun, and now I can't walk. So
yeah, the dog's fine. Maggie isn't.
Yeah. So now I'm like walking around like a true, like a peg leg, like I'm a pirate.
You're hobbled.
Yeah. The bruising is really the worst part.
Well, it's also that tooth that touched bone.
Yeah. No, I think the worst part was that I got blood on my Birkenstocks. And I'm upset about that because Birkenstocks aren't cheap. Cam's not upset though, because he hates Birkenstocks and he hates when I wear them, and I wear them just to annoy him.
I've decided to hate every dog on the planet.
I know, and I was so in the position where I wanted to get a dog, and now I know you will never let us get a dog.
Because they betrayed me.
No, because that dog is not well trained and he needs a better owner. Doesn't matter.
Who am I loyal to?
He protects.
Who am I loyal to? Clifford the Big Red Dog or my co-host in the podcast of life?
If I was an intruder trying to attack my very elderly grandmother, that intruder has no chance at hurting my grandmother. So we are all safer for it. Anyway, if you've been bit by a dog, send us an email at secondbreakfastpod@gmail.com. I'm never wishing interesting things upon myself ever again. It's a major regret. What are we doing today, Cam?
Yeah, so today's a bit of a fun one. We still have some more Summerween. We have a couple fun ones that we planned out. I think it's 3 more that we have.
Sorry, if you want to see pictures of my nasty bruises, we have to get enough comments and likes. I don't know if I can online engagement. So if you really want to see my nasty bruise, then you got to send us emails and shit. Okay, sorry.
Sure,
continue.
Let's turn everything into content.
Yes. So look, I made you some content.
So we've got 3 Summerween movies left, and we've chosen them. We've got some great feedback and recommendations from you guys. I'm even getting some on my Twitter, which I never promote because why not?
It's your own Twitter.
I'll throw it in the description for this one.
Yeah,
but yeah,
we don't have a Twitter account, but
people send me stuff and recommend things. It's very cool.
Yeah, because you promote the show on your own Twitter. So yeah. Great.
So today we were going to do another Summerween, but
then things happen.
Yeah, well, we got a bunch of. Well, it's not even the dog thing, but
I don't mean the dog thing.
We've gotten a bunch of emails and comments and things about our announcement to cover House of the Dragon.
Yeah. Which we're doing in August when that starts.
Right. For those 10 weeks, we're going to, on our Tuesdays, we're going to break down the episodes. And it's Tuesday, not Monday, so we have an opportunity to get feedback from you guys. So it'll really be more of a discussion. I'm excited to go through a new story with this whole kind of community. It's a really cool opportunity, but people were asking, why are we doing this? Why are we not doing any other shows? Why are we not doing the Rings of Power thing? And so I wanted to... Instead of pitting any shows against each other, I wanted to just make the positive case and explain why we're doing this. So this is an episode about House of the Dragon, and it is... I've read everything pretty much about this show, all the interviews and cover stories. I mean, it's a big thing, and HBO has quite the media machine. So there are plenty of cover stories with real interviews with the creatives behind it. And Maggie has watched the trailers.
Yes.
But to make it interesting, she hasn't read anything, and I haven't watched any trailers.
Yes.
So we get to tell each other about the show, just as we're explaining to you guys this decision.
Yeah. And there was a big trailer that came out earlier this week during San Diego Comic-Con. So that's why we're doing this right now, is because we wanted to get, respond to the inquiries we've been getting, react to the trailer. Like, it was timely. So that's why we're interrupting Summerween. But don't worry, we're still going to finish out Summerween. No problem.
Yeah. And these 3 are... real fun that we have left.
I just moved my leg in a horrible way. Sorry.
So, you want me to go first?
Well, mine's a bit more surface level than yours, I think.
That's okay.
Mine's just I'm saying maybe we should start with mine so that we can do a nice, slow,
I would
deep dive.
I would rather have the context of the show. Like I think I want the words before learning about what the show looks like.
That's fine.
Like learning the recipe before you
That's
eat
fine.
the meal.
I'll just sit here and bask in the pain I'm feeling in my life.
Cool.
Great.
So I did pull some quotes and ideas, kind of the essence from the San Diego Comic-Con panel, which George R. R. Martin was at. He canceled some of the signings on the floor because he was worried about COVID, which makes sense given his age, and I'm glad he was safe.
Yeah.
But he was on that panel, and he was very talkative.
Cute.
Which is always good. I love his interviews.
Yeah, he's great.
But most of what I'm pulling from here, I basically had to cut down 6,000 words of things into something palatable. If you haven't heard our episodes where we go through Christopher Tolkien's history of Lord of the Rings, it's a lot like that.
Yeah.
So a lot of this is from the Hollywood Reporter 2-part cover story by James Hibbard. We'll throw the link in the episode description there.
I really enjoy the Hollywood Reporter. I feel like they do a great job.
Yeah, they do.
They're not super like clickbaity.
No.
I mean, but
for being like an establishment media kind of promotion tool, it is quite substantial.
Yeah, they're great.
And I wanted to throw James Hibbard's name out because I agree this was really well done. It's two parts to this story, and it's definitely worth reading. So I've broken it down into little details here. They've got the cast, they've got the directors and the writers, and everyone kind of in this big soup of an interview. And they're describing House of the Dragon as a family drama. And they're differentiating it from Game of Thrones by saying it's more intimate because it's focusing on one family, because it's just about the Targaryens.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And so it does so, like it on focusing on a smaller subject, you can use a larger scope. Because you don't have to fit in the whole like world beyond Westeros. If it's just about that family,
you can really dig in.
Right.
I mean, the way that we were able to finally dig into our core characters at the end of Game of Thrones by the time everybody else had died, So yeah, good.
So it's doing that with a larger scope. There are multiple time jumps because we're pulling from the histories of the Targaryens.
Yes, I got that from the trailer.
Yeah, so
I'll talk about that.
There are multiple time jumps in the show, and they're calling the first season kind of a slow burn. Because they want, one of the cooler quotes, I think it was Matt Smith or someone in a group interview, they were saying that they wanted you to quickly know all of the major players so that the combat means something.
Yes.
They want you to know all the players before the first sword falls, I think was the line they used that I remember.
Cool.
And it's a 10-episode season, so familiar pacing to most of Game of Thrones. At the end there, it got a little short, but I don't think this is going to end up like Game of Thrones did at all.
I certainly hope not.
And all of this reminded me of The Crown. The family focus, slow burn, multiple time jumps.
Totally.
And this show is borrowing another element from The Crown.
Matt Smith?
Yeah. Exactly. But it's also recasting certain key roles in those different time periods.
Yes.
So it starts with... it's basically 4 main characters, 2 male and 2 female. And it looks like it begins with the female and then they get aged up.
Yes.
When it jumps into the main continuity that we're playing with.
Yes.
And they're calling this a story of generational war, which makes sense for the recasting and that tight focus on a family.
Yeah,
George R. R. Martin compares King Viserys to King Lear, which is great because we spent so much of our time talking about Shakespeare and those great old school family structure power dynamics that he was so good at.
Yeah. I mean, all the War of the Roses stuff that's prevalent in the Lannister, Stark stuff, like that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, Lancaster and York.
That's what it is. Yeah, I couldn't remember the
War of the Roses. So this whole show, and this was another great diversion from maybe what we expected after Game of Thrones. House of the Dragon is largely set in the Red Keep. And so they used Leavesden Studios, which was actually used for the Harry Potter franchise. And they built out one huge continuous set.
Cool.
Which had all the, connected rooms and staircases and little alcoves and nooks and corners. So they could, pull out walls and stuff. But it would feel more real and lived in for the cast. And just, to create a sense of continuity to it. I was very excited about that.
So I don't know how they did it in the original show. Was it just a bunch of random sound stages?
I think so.
I don't know. I mean, I know they did a lot of stuff on location for like exterior shots, but I didn't know about interior stuff.
I don't think they made it seem like this was more extensive and fully realized than they'd done before. Maybe because it was such a principal set, they could spend that money.
Right. Versus in the original show where you'd have to do that for 18 castles. So
for every storyline.
Yeah. Okay.
And it's not just on a soundstage. They spent a lot of time filming in Spain, Portugal, and Northern England.
Cool. Mm-hmm.
And this was the part that really hooked me, and part of the explanation to why we're covering this on our weekly Tuesdays instead of Rings of Power. So there was a discussion here between Ryan Condal, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, Condal, who is basically the lead writer on the show, and Miguel Sapochnik. And he's kind of the hero Game of Thrones director who did all the big battle episodes. If you go back, he was the guy they pulled in for Long Night and Hard Home and
Battle of the Bastards.
I think so. All of those big boy episodes. He was the guy for directing Game of Thrones. So they pulled him in as what the show looks like, and George R. R. Martin handpicked Ryan Condal as the writer. And they crafted these two guys together as a power duo. This is the power couple of House of the Dragon. They're specifically modeling themselves to be the new Benioff and Weiss. To the point that, I mean, these two guys, Sapochnik and Condal, weren't previously working together in the same way Benioff and Weiss were. So for the first year of all the pre-production stuff, they took every single meeting together.
Wow.
So they could develop that relationship and eventually learn the other's instincts.
Cool.
So even when they weren't in the same meetings, both sides would be represented.
That's nice.
So I love that they're pulling from the past, but they're also moving into the future with a different crop of writers. Because a lot of the old crew were pretty burnt out. You know, Benioff and Weiss didn't want to jump into another decade-long commitment.
Understandable, especially after an ending that wasn't received very well, and they might just want to...
I think it was mostly the time commitment. I mean, they all aged like presidents.
They probably just want to do other things besides Game of Thrones. Yeah.
I mean, Sapochnik was part of that. I think it took a while for them to bring him in because it was such... it was just the scale of the end of Game of Thrones was like nothing we've really seen in pop culture since.
It's huge.
I mean, Marvel movies have more money, but I would argue the end of Game of Thrones had more cultural cachet.
Absolutely.
Which means more eyeballs, which means more pressure. Especially juggling such an ensemble cast. So there was this discussion early on where they were talking about the name of a king and the name of a dragon, and the names were kind of similar. And someone on set was like, I think it was a cast member. They were saying, it sounded like I was talking about Disney World for a second.
Cast member,
It was an actor who said like, we got to change some of these names, right? And I think it was Ryan Condal was like, no, we can't.
Because those are the names that George gave them.
That's what the names are. So, and that kind of set a template, and this is a quote, which firmly established that the production would take a staunchly loyalist approach to adapting Martin's complex world.
Imagine that.
Exactly.
Sorry, I'm being...
No, I mean, all of that is going to be implied through that episode. And we're not going to be pissy and make the comparisons, but they're all there. And they're relevant.
Yeah.
So here's a quote from Ryan Condal. You can't follow Game of Thrones. It's the Beatles. I'm setting out as a fan to make the thing I want to see, and I'm happy with what we've achieved. The Targaryens are like the Jedi in Star Wars, where you heard about them, and you heard about this time when they were plentiful and powerful and always wanted to see that, and now you get to. So I wanted to learn a little more about Ryan Condal, and luckily the article went into it. He first met with George R. R. Martin on 2013, and he was shooting a pilot in near Santa Fe, and the pilot fell apart, and George pilfered some of the actors for Game of Thrones.
Cool.
Like Pedro Pascal. And they've been friends ever since.
Wow, cool.
And George picked Ryan Condal to adapt and run this show. I mean, there were so many ideas in the running for what was going to be the next thing in this world.
Yeah.
And eventually he brought up Ryan Condal's name. He said, quote, I wasn't ready to give up on it being the House of the Dragon pitch. And I liked Ryan's writing, and he really knew my world well, which was a big thing. Yes. House of the Dragon was one of 15 pitches to be the next Game of Thrones, coming from... It's basically adapting 6 chapters from Fire and Blood, which is written as an in-world kind of textbook. It's an old maester writing a history of the Targaryen, so it's written in that style. It's more dry and more almost nonfiction, of course, though it is fiction.
Yeah, but it's written like historical text rather than narrative.
And apparently there are 6 chapters within that, from what I could get from just kind of a pinch hitting online trying to figure it out. There are 6 chapters in that long book that... chronicle a Targaryen civil war. And that's the story that we're playing with here. Yeah. I think in the book it's called The Dance of the Dragons.
Yes, I was reading some comments on the trailer and people kept mentioning that, and I think that's what that's supposed to be.
So that's the template for the show.
Yeah.
And I like that, and I'll get into that a little bit later about the joy of having a complete product to adapt, and that is another point of contrast back to Game of Thrones.
Yes, right.
But something else that San Diego Comic-Con had House of the Dragon panel and trailer. Yeah. It also had a lot of stuff for Rings of Power. Amazon really threw some money out there to make a splash. And I watched that trailer. Yeah. And I thought it was the best trailer they've released so far.
It was, yeah.
But the strange thing here for Rings of Power, there have been like 3 or 4 teaser trailers, and this is the first one they're calling an official trailer.
Yeah.
I don't know what the story is.
Nope. I still don't know what the story is.
It's worrying the longer they don't tell you what the story is.
And not that all trailers have to tell you what the premise is. I really like an ambiguous trailer that just kind of gives you a sense of the vibe. But
yeah, for an art house horror movie.
Yeah, right. But when you have 4 teasers and a trailer and I still don't know who the main character is or what the story is going to be about, then I'm confused.
And what's the thing that's bringing people to the table here?
Tolkien's name.
Story. The lore.
Yeah.
The thousands of pages of Tolkien that people have loved for generations across every race, color, and creed. Mm-hmm. By contrast, Miguel Sapochnik breaking down the prequel story in the simplest of terms. Quote, the main characters are 2 women and 2 men. There's the king, Viserys, his brother, Daemon, the king's daughter, Rhaena, and her best friend, Alicent. Then the best friend becomes the king's wife and thereby the queen. That in itself is complicated when your best friend goes and marries your dad. But from the tiniest things, it slowly evolves this gigantic battle between 2 sides.
Uh-huh. Yeah, perfect. Easy.
So that's
I also got that from the trailer.
That's him, exactly. Yeah. That's him riffing in an interview, an elevator pitch. And in a world with 75 streaming services and 2 million shows that, I meant to watch that and didn't.
Yeah.
You gotta hook people.
Yeah.
You gotta make the effort.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm frustrated by the kind of mood board trailers that don't hook you. Yeah. Because especially now when tickets are like $20.
Yeah.
I wish you could just go out there and write the story you believed in and pitch something beautiful to people and they will go. Mm-hmm. But you've kind of just got to lock them down and get their attention and keep it.
Right. Well, also, and, oh God, what was I going to say?
But for a show that's all about family dynamics and conflict and power struggles, I like that it does have an elevator pitch. Knowing that it's going to get all twisty, turny, and go upside down after that, I like that there's a clear starting point, and then you hear the pistol fire and the horses start running.
Yeah, I know what I was going to say. So both of these shows, Rings of Power, House of the Dragon, are working within a world that we're already familiar with, we've already heard stories from. So to then not tell us what the story is really confusing, because if I hear, they're making a show about Lord of the Rings, I'll go, what do you mean? Like, who's in it? Like, who's it? What's the story? I've already heard that story. Right. And I know that, that we know that it's about the Second Age, and Galadriel's there, Elrond is vaguely there, there are hobbits, there's dwarves, but like, what? Like there's, to not know what the story is within this world that you're used to is confusing and kind of makes you a little concerned.
And we did an episode about Rings of Power, and that was most of what we were saying. Those were the worries that we had. We were talking about the distance from the source material. We were talking about Amazon not having the rights to a lot of the relevant source material about the Second Age. Yeah. And again, by contrast, and this is really the thing that made the decision, because you can throw all the money in the world, like we've talked about lately. You can throw all the money in the world at a show and hire the best actors and have the best cinematographers and have the best special effects. If the writing's bad, no one cares, and the thing falls apart.
Yes.
So this I thought was the most, I'm trying to kind of tee up something that I thought was the most important part of this Hollywood Reporter article, which was really the reason I wanted to talk about this here. So they took a moment, it felt like an aside to this promotional kind of hype piece, which is what the article is. There's nothing wrong with that. Yeah. But it feels like they took this aside, this kind of serious moment. They addressed George R. R. Martin's distance from Game of Thrones in the later seasons, where he was very much out of the loop. The whole time the show was running, he said, you got to do 10 seasons. It's not going to work unless you do 10 seasons. It's going to be paced wrong. Things are going to feel rushed. Yeah. And what's people's complaint about the end?
Rushed.
Maybe the Dany turn wasn't set up enough, and maybe more episodes could
Lo and behold. Yeah.
Right. Mm-hmm. So here's an interesting quote. And this isn't just George talking. This is higher-ups. This is content, advisors and producers for HBO. This is high-level people. quote, around the time HBO produced and rejected Blood Moon, which was the first prequel show, they filmed a whole pilot and then just shit canned the whole thing.
That's right. I forgot about that.
And it was going to be Naomi Watts, who's the lead in the Ring reboot, who's fantastic.
Yeah.
So that's kind of sad.
And she was in Funny Games.
Yeah.
Which we talked about.
Yeah. So she's fantastic.
She's great.
And they said the show wasn't bad or anything. It was very good. It just wasn't Game of Thrones. It wasn't, and I don't mean that it wasn't exactly the same, but they didn't think it was on that level.
Yeah.
And they didn't want to diminish the brand.
Yeah.
So here's the quote. Around the time HBO produced and rejected the first prequel show, Blood Moon, they all agree, meaning all the producers and stuff in the interview, they all agree that Martin's influence rose within the company. Put simply, HBO thought, hey, maybe we ought to listen more to the guy who created all this. So as part of that, they signed a 5-year deal with George R. R. Martin. The HBO signed that big new deal with him, which was a lot of money.
I'm sure it was, yeah.
But another kind of stipulation, a part of maybe the character of that deal, this is another quote, every subsequent project HBO has put into development based on his work has received his approval and the kind of close involvement he hasn't had since the early days of Game of Thrones.
Wow. Good for him. That's amazing.
And this is the deciding factor for me. You are getting the story from the horse's mouth.
Yes.
And with the horse's oversight.
Yes. I very much approve of that.
I don't need him to write all the scripts. I don't need him to hold the camera. But having the creator's involvement and guidance and to some extent approval being required for some of these things versus the trouble you get into when the creator's dead, the creator's son is dead, and the estate is on a licensing blitz of mobile games and shitty video games and selling to the...
And there are all these battles about who has the rights to what. Like the reason that the Rings of Power is not going to be super true to Tolkien's content is because they only have the rights to the appendices. Right. Like they don't have the rights to the Silmarillion or the Unfinished Tales or anything else. And so they only have so much they can work within. So they have to improvise and make up a lot of stuff.
And that doesn't mean that anyone working on the Rings of Power is a bad person.
No.
This is the idiocy of kind of media literacy and discussion today. Yeah. We're not saying any of that.
No.
I fully believe, I watched some interviews from San Diego Comic-Con. These people are passionate and excited.
Yeah.
My problem is just with the source material. Yeah. It's that you only have scraps from the appendices. You don't have a lot of the stuff that Christopher threw into the Silmarillion. And they're even breaking a lot of that. Condensing down thousands of years, dropping certain characters, changing, adding, Harfoot hobbits back into the story. It just, I don't like it. And I think they fired the Tolkien scholar for saying this is not what we signed up for.
Oh, that's great.
And anyway, it's just that's the difference. That kind of wholesale invention.
Yeah.
It's not what you want with someone's life work.
Yes,
when you spend that much time crafting a world that has bewitched generations of people worldwide. And it doesn't need to be reinvented.
And I feel like with this comparison, the way I'm looking at Rings of Power, we've both said this, we don't want that show to fail. Like, I want it to be good, right?
Of course.
But I'm going to be looking at it more in the realm of like a fan fiction and offshoot versus like, whereas House of the Dragon, I'm looking at it like a continuation of and part of the actual canon of Game of Thrones.
As you should.
Yeah, because it's coming from the original creator with his permission, his oversight, and his approval.
And House of the Dragon, there's an emphasis here that they're not riffing. Game of Thrones had partial riffing, right?
Because they had to, because they ran out of content.
So they had 5 out of 7 books. So the last couple seasons were riffing.
Yeah, and they went off of a lot of what George had laid out in terms of, like, even though the books weren't written, he was like, here's what happens, and they kind of went off script.
So let's call that 70% source material, 30% riffing.
Yeah.
Rings of Power, let's call 70% riffing, 30% source material.
Yeah,
I love that House of the Dragon kind of neatly avoids both of those issues. They know their ending. They have those discrete 6 chapters from Fire and Blood. And already, because there's such rigor at HBO for this brand and maintaining, the authenticity of it, especially still having George alive and involved, there's a plan for the production to run a certain number of seasons. They already know the arc for it. And they said it might be shorter than you expect. They're looking at like 3 or 4 seasons.
I was going to say, do we know how many? So
3 or
that's
4
what
seasons.
they're hoping for. Okay.
If it is a runaway success, or, I mean, they already said, like, we're not expecting it to do Game of Thrones season 8 numbers.
No.
You only get to those numbers spending 10 years building up the characters.
Yeah,
you know?
of course. Yeah.
But they said, should it prove very successful, the advantage of having so much of the rest of the story in Fire and Blood is that you can expand out from there, forward or backward. They said both directions.
That's cool.
In Targaryen history.
Yeah, because it's not like they're not covering all of Fire and Blood, just this one chunk of it. So they could do other chunks if they wanted to. And even
Fire and Blood is half of the Targaryen history. The second volume hasn't been published yet.
Oh, I didn't realize there were going to be 2 volumes.
Yeah, wow. George said he wants to finish Winds of Winter first.
I mean, that's what every human in the world wants. Yeah.
But I also don't begrudge him taking his time.
No, especially because that means that he has more involvement in these shows and stuff.
A delayed product is good eventually. A rushed product is bad forever.
Yes, I'm just saying, if we can avoid other delays, let's avoid them.
There was a game developer who said that. I tried to remember his name and I forgot.
Way to go.
So, George has, I don't know why I feel like I'm on first name terms with him, but I literally always have.
Yeah, you always call him George.
So, George has viewed...
What if we had called him Jolkin?
Good.
Everyone knows that it's Jolkin, Rolkin, Tolkien.
So George has since viewed 9 of the 10 episodes for House of the Dragon Season 1 in various stages, and his excitement has only grown. Quote,
Aww.
It's powerful, it's visceral, it's dark. It's like a Shakespearean tragedy. There's no Arya, there's no Arya, a character everybody's going to love. They're all flawed. They're all human. They do good.
Interesting.
They do good things. They do bad things. They're driven by lust for power, jealousy, old wounds, just like human beings, just like I wrote them.
Very cool. That sounds amazing.
Which is all I can ask for.
Yes. Yeah. Go ahead. Sorry.
No.
Well, I don't know if you had more to say. I was going to transition.
I just have a little more.
Yes, go for it.
Yeah, another quote from San Diego Comic-Con. He said, "These books are like my kids, but when you give them up for adoption, you're nervous on how they'll turn out. But I've been very, very fortunate here." Aww. The cast also emphasized the family drama element, the fun of that, the politics, their familiarity with the original show and books. One of the I forget the I think it's the actor's name is Emma Darcy.
Okay.
Who I think uses they them pronouns.
Okay.
Who plays one of the female characters, one of those leads.
Okay.
But they were talking about how interesting the gender politics are in this world. Yeah. And they were talking about starting this show at the very height of the Targaryen power. If you're playing with a civil war, you want to show the good, right? Yeah. You want to push the boulder down the hill and then let it get rolling. Yeah. And they were talking about all the interesting kind of ideas that you stumble into about empire. How does an empire fall apart? How does it end? What would it give up? Like, why would an empire, why would a patriarchal empire, this was kind of the gender element, they were saying that this sort of patriarchy would rather destroy itself than let a woman take over.
Well, exactly, yeah.
But also these other ideas of empire and eternity and history, and it seemed like they were thinking about all the things I want them to be thinking about. Like the stuff we talk about. Yeah. And that's all I want from people. Yeah. Is to be able to have a discussion like what I have with you. Yes, exactly. That's all I'm looking for. The only other little tidbit, I tried to avoid just kind of boilerplate promotional stuff. Yeah. But there was a tidbit about this being such a different era for the Targaryens and how that affects the role of dragons in the show. There are at least 17 dragons in this show. Holy shit. Ryan Condal says, the biggest difference about this series is the fact that dragons exist in this era, whereas they were extinct species that came back to life in the original shows. Yes. So there's an infrastructure built around them. There's a dragon pit, saddles, and dragon keepers. This monk-like order that takes care of them. Oh, cool. I love that. And I didn't want to include anything more spoilery than that, but what a cool little pinprick. Well, that's great. Yeah, because I was thinking, when I watched this trailer, my first thought was this feels exactly like Game of Thrones in the best way. Like it didn't feel like a different show that has shades of the same thing. I think we were talking about the Rings of Power trailer, and you said that it kind of reminded you of Fantastic Beasts, just in the way, I think in terms of how the effects looked and just the way that it, like in that analogy, it vaguely looks like the world that it's pulling from, but it's a bit different and not quite as good. Just kind of toothless. It was okay and fluffy. Yeah. But There's no impression left.
Like I love the Fantastic Beasts movies. We've talked about them on the show.
Me too.
They're great, but they're not the same. In the
not
same way
everything
that
you love is good.
And that's the vibe I'm getting from Rings of Power.
Yeah.
That is not the vibe I'm getting from House of the Dragon. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just remembered something you were saying when we were watching the Rings of Power thing, because you came home and I'd already watched it, and I said, this new trailer looks much better than the rest of it.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted you to watch it. I pulled it up on the big TV.
Yeah.
And we were watching it, and I think we finished it, and you said, it looks fake.
Yes. It doesn't, I don't believe it. It looks like a show that was made in a studio. It doesn't look like a believable world.
And I think the problem for me will end up being the dialogue.
Yeah.
But I agree, there's just something.
Yeah.
There's just some little X factor. And it's so difficult to capture.
It is. And especially because I don't work in film and TV. Like
right.
I don't, but I feel like I have enough artistic and visual literacy that I can talk about it. But it didn't feel right. But watching this trailer, it felt like the next season of Game of Thrones.
Okay.
It felt like perfectly like it belonged in the world. And obviously there are a lot of similarities. Like you have King's Landing and the Red Keep, and you have the Iron Throne, and you have dragons, and you have blonde people who are Targaryens. Like you have a lot of crossover. And so I was thinking, like, do I only like this because it's just Game of Thrones? Like, how is this going to be different?
Sure.
How is this going to be, not just a carbon copy, but with different characters? Like, I don't want it to be the same show with different characters, especially because the premise is relatively the same when you boil it down. It's who's going to get the throne next. I mean, that's all it is, because it's this king who doesn't have an heir because all he has is daughters. But he has this brother. So it's like, does the brother get it? Does, for some reason, a woman start to inherit the throne and his daughter gets it? Does he have a new son with this new wife? Like, it's just, again, it's a battle for the throne. I mean, that's so oversimplifying it.
Right.
But essentially, that's what the first show is about. That's what this is about.
In the same way, all Jane Austen books are rich people going to each other's houses.
Yeah. And everyone gets married at the end. But yeah, so I was like worried that I was just biased to just liking it because it felt familiar to me. But
which is fine.
Sure, but I like that you've brought up the thing about like dragons being like an infrastructure, or there being an infrastructure around the dragons, and that being a different thing, and it being more insular and focused on one family instead of 6 families, and you have those differences, and of course, like, it's more micro, and also it ends up being like this. It's a prequel, so it's a precursor to the Game of Thrones conflict, and it establishes, there are a lot of conflicts in the original Game of Thrones. You've got a lot of working parts, but a major one is Dany and her claim to the throne. Without this show, without the possibility of a woman being able to inherit the throne, Dany has no claim. That wouldn't even work, because apparently, like, pre this time, only men are inheriting the throne. So Dany would have zero claim if that hadn't changed, if that change hadn't happened. So it's setting it all up really well. I mean, the trailer is beautiful. I can kind of walk you through like what happens. I mean, it really just establishes, like, we got the Targaryens. We have this king. Who's his heir? He's got a brother and he's got a daughter. What are we going to do? There's another lady. What's going to happen? That's pretty much it.
I'm almost more interested in like a general impression.
Yeah.
Of like the music, the look, the color, the costumes.
In terms of
a lot
aesthetics,
of those things you objected to in Rings of Power as
yes.
well.
I mean, the first thing I noticed of it being like, this is like Game of Thrones, is the aesthetics. It's the costumes, it's the sets. And again, part of that is because you have literally the same, or sets that look the same, like the Iron Throne, King's Landing, stuff like that. But it's different enough that it still feels like its own thing. But like the costumes feel like they belong in the world. The hairstyles are all just, that show was really well done. I was watching this Game of Thrones I was watching a video of this woman on YouTube named Bernadette Banners. She's like this really interesting, quirky expert on historical dress, and she does a lot of videos like, is this show historically accurate? And like, it's like fun. But she talked about how historically accurate Game of Thrones is. Obviously not actually, because it's a made-up world and a made-up time. But she has this like 45-minute video that I haven't even finished, where she's going into detail about how much thought the costume designers and hairstylists we're putting in to create a world that looks like it is lived in, exists, and like has a set framework for technology, how textiles are made, how garments are made. You know, up in the north, they don't have any fun colors because they are, you know, they don't have good agriculture up there. They're not making textiles.
Right.
All their stuff is leather, furs, like wool, like stuff that comes from animals rather than from farming. And down in the south, it's a lot of silks because that's what they have. And like, oh, King's Landing has all kinds of colors and stuff because they have all these trade routes. But then when things start to kind of go south and they can't trade as much, all the colors become more muted. So she talks all about how much thought and care is put into the aesthetics of that show. And that really seems to carry forward into from what I saw in this trailer.
And I know there are experts in those fields hired for all of these big projects.
Yeah,
But there's just an X factor. There's something that doesn't happen for some franchises, but when it does, it blows your mind.
Yeah, I mean,
it didn't happen. I mean, we've talked about this before in the context of Star Wars was the example at the time. We talked about it having this unbelievably specific, but unmistakable, ruthlessly particular and I don't even know what the right word is. Yeah, but like, it also it weeds out things. If something doesn't fit in with the visual language,
it's immediately
you
apparent.
Immediately can tell.
We were talking about that. There's an episode of Boba Fett that has these characters that immediately didn't look like they fit into Star Wars.
Yeah, it was these bikes they were riding that were these like Technicolor chrome things. And your brain,
like a transformer.
Your brain rejects it. Your brain says, that's not Star Wars. What the fuck is that?
And that was something that I think The Witcher show really struggled with, was there was no consistent visual language and easily identify, like the world was not identifiable as the world of The Witcher versus like, even though Westeros and Essos are these two giant continents that span all these different cultures, you know, the costumes in Karth look nothing like the Winterfell costumes, but you can identify all of them as Game of Thrones.
And honestly, I don't think Marvel's ever done this well. I don't think DC's ever done this well. I don't think Harry Potter did this well. The only things that have done this well that I can call to memory in live action, you know, genre stuff is Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings movies, Hobbit 2, and Game of Thrones.
Yeah.
Where they have that unmistakable, eternal visual language.
Yeah, I disagree with you on Harry Potter. I'm not counting Fantastic Beasts.
That's a different discussion.
But yeah. Like, yeah, so there's...
It has nothing to do with effort. I know they're hardworking people on every film set in the world, and I know that no one sets out to make a bad thing.
No.
And I'm not disparaging anyone who's trying to make something. As someone who fucking makes things, I'm not disparaging that intent at all.
Right. But it's just...
when you follow something that does... It has such a singular artistic vision and visual focus, I'm glad to hear that they managed something that felt true.
It felt like it was part of the world, and it felt like what I had imagined these characters talking about when they were talking about the old reign of the Targaryens in the original show and in the books. Because we obviously, like, we get some vague Targaryen flashbacks in the show, but not really. Like, we don't ever see, like, the Targaryens at their height, like in any full detail. And so
they're in exile at the beginning.
Right. So this is the first time we're seeing it, and it looks exactly like how you think it would look. And that's really, really great. And I'm excited to see, like, because this is supposed to take place, 200 years before the show, or much longer? I don't remember.
I think it's close to that, yeah.
You know, centuries before the original show. So obviously, like, the technology is going to be a bit different. The costumes are how are they going to make it look more old fashioned, again, in a fake world? Like, that's going to be really interesting.
And they talked a little bit about the history of some of those locations that we know from 200 years later. The staircase with the fight between the Hound and the Mountain.
Yeah.
They're like, it was weird kind of building that one again because it's intact here. But it means so much to us from a different era.
Yes. Well, that's what else I was going to say is that because it's a prequel and because I know these people are good at what they do, there are going to be, I think, a lot of really nice nods and just little foreshadowings to what we know so well from the original show. And I think that's going to be
funny.
Really great.
Like, culturally, we are in the era of the prequel. And I know this isn't a hot take. It's a 15-year-old idea. But so often with prequels, people just reject it. And it's either because you're trying to bring something back that they loved when they're kids and they're not as happy. Life isn't as simple as when they were kids.
Yeah.
So they don't derive the same enjoyment from it and they get pissed and start resenting it. Sometimes that happens. But the rejection of prequels is so fascinating because it does feel like almost a lizard brain instinctual thing. Because it's not across the board. Look what happened to George Lucas with the Star Wars prequels.
Yeah.
Versus sometimes it works out.
Right.
Better Call Saul.
Right.
A beloved prequel that feels faithful to the original, feels like it keeps that visual language.
Yeah.
Hobbit, mixed bag.
Very much.
The trying to do something with Harry Potter, Fantastic Beasts, very mixed bag.
Yeah.
Most people don't care for it.
Yeah.
It feels like it's a really tough needle to thread.
Yeah.
And it doesn't mean that anyone who makes a prequel that isn't received well is a bad person.
Do you know what I think is a big part of it? Is that the prequel, the story is not being written for the show or movie.
Right.
It's already there. I think that makes a really big difference. I think when you try, I mean, I don't know, I've never written a TV show, but it seems like when you try to write a new story in this medium, like that's meant to take place before, you just run into a lot of, I don't know, like stumbling a bit too much in trying to nod to the original but still be its own thing, and it just, I don't know why it works better when you're adapting it.
But there's also just less air in the tires.
Yeah.
Because we know how it ends.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's people, I mean, spoilers still affect people. It matters that we want to know how the thing ends. We want to know how it resolves.
Yeah.
If you have that in the back of your mind, it's a little hard to get excited.
Yeah, versus this, which is so far back that it's not really about how it ends.
It's its own thing.
Because it ends before the original story even begins.
I was listening to an interview with Mark Millar, who's a writer. He's done pretty much everything you can do in comic books, and he was kind of the template for the MCU. I'm saying the guy knows his way around storytelling.
Yeah.
And he was talking about prequels as being sort of frustrating dead ends. It was interesting to hear it from someone who's in that position of writing them. You just said, you're not in that position. And he was talking about how complicated they are.
Yeah.
And that there's not much that people are still excited for. I thought that was an interesting kind of tidbit.
Yeah. So it is nice that there is this new thing that I am in fact very excited for.
Oh, I'm sorry. My brain completely shut down while I was talking.
Oh, that's okay.
The point was, he was saying the mistake with Star Wars when they brought it back for this new trilogy that they just did, he was saying they should have gone a couple 100 years down the line with completely new characters.
Yes.
Then there's no talk of continuity. There's no comparison. That you don't have to deal
keep
with
animating dead actors.
You don't have to deal with the legacy, whatever.
Yeah.
And I think you can apply a lot of those arguments to a lot of the other prequels we're talking about.
Totally.
Here.
And that's what's great about this is there's so much distance that it makes it work.
Exactly. Yeah. It's its own thing.
Yeah. Also, very worth noting, Ramin Djawadi is doing the score. He did
whole score?
As far as I could tell. I didn't do research because that was I tried not to read too much, but
I imagine he is.
From what I can tell, it's him. And he's the one who did the original show, in case you don't know. Some people don't know composer names.
but he was such a huge part of that show.
So in what year did the last season come out of Game of Thrones? It's like 2018. Yeah. Whatever year that was.
I was in New York.
I was in Iowa.
So yeah.
Whatever year that was, my top Spotify artist was Ramin Djawadi.
Yeah.
Because all I listened to was the Game of Thrones score. Because it's just so good.
But there's a reason they brought back John Williams for Star Wars.
Yeah.
Do you know how much money Amazon must have thrown at Howard Shore to only write the main title?
I was going to say,
Rings of Power?
I am really pleased that they got him involved in some way. But yeah, I think when the music is so good, especially for a big fantasy thing where the score is really important, maintaining that continuity, I think, is essential for the success of the show. Not that it always has to happen, but it feels pretty necessary. I think if you're arguing that the Harry Potter movies maybe struggle with this a bit, there are like 18 composers for the Harry Potter movies. I mean, you have John Williams do the first two, but then there are like 5 or 6 others throughout the course of the movies, and it just makes it feel a bit, I mean, I love all of those scores, but they feel a bit inconsistent. And
like I'm trying to think back, all the times in my life I've heard anyone use the word world building. It's about fantasy adaptations. Yeah. And there are so, like, Wheel of Time just didn't really take with people. Yeah. In the same way that all the other things
which is wild because those books are so popular in the fantasy community.
But when you've already built out the world, and this is, I mean, you're standing on the shoulders of giants, not just with Tolkien, but with Peter Jackson, with Benioff and Weiss, with all of these other kind of this fantasy thing that exists now. It's so hard to live up to that.
Yeah.
Like, how do you find more room on Mount Rushmore? And I get the impulse to do your own thing.
Yeah.
But I also understand audience members are always going to compare you.
Yeah.
It's such a, I don't know how to resolve that conflict.
No, I don't either.
It feels like it's pulling at all of these franchises right now. Do we want to do new things, or do we want to get people back for the thing they loved?
Right.
Yeah. Everyone wants to see Han Solo again, but you nuke him in the first movie.
Yes. Right. It doesn't make a lot of sense. Yeah. After I'd watched the trailer, I was reading the comments a bit just to gauge what because I honestly have no idea what people are thinking about this new show. And maybe YouTube comments on the trailer are not the best way to gauge. But for the most part, nearly everybody was excited and like maybe a bit hesitantly optimistic, but everyone was saying, this looks great. I really hope it's better than the way that Game of Thrones ended. Like people who appreciated Game of Thrones when it was at its peak, and they're hoping that that's what this continues to be.
Yeah, and it's such like back of the napkin math. When did people stop loving Game of Thrones universally?
Yeah,
when they went past the books. What do they have here? A distinct and full outline from books.
Exactly. And when I was watching the trailer again, it felt like not only the aesthetics, but it just like it felt like Game of Thrones in that I can tell there's going to be a lot of cool action with the dragons and sword fighting. I can tell there's going to be a lot of cool like political maneuvering and people betraying each other. Like there's one character who I can tell is going to be a real meddler. Like that's going to be really interesting. And like, I love all the blonde Targaryens. I think that's so fun. And just it feels so familiar, but also like, oh, it's brand new and it's really exciting.
There's always we've talked about this in a fantasy context too, this idea of passing the torch with one instance of kind of poignant casting. We talked about Sean Bean going from Lord of the Rings being brought into Game of Thrones.
Yeah.
It's interesting that the guy who played young Ned Stark is then brought in to be, I believe, young Elrond.
Yes,
in
that's
Rings
right.
of Power.
That is,
like
right.
trying to pick up that torch and continue the fantasy thing with one central character. And I really love, I love HBO. It's like A24. When else can you say you love a brand without sounding like a dork?
A brand, yeah.
But I loved when Game of Thrones ended. And there was this couple of years of what's going to be the next Game of Thrones.
Yeah.
Not just meaning what's going to make us money, but what's going to be this intense character drama that just rivets people. And they didn't say, what's the next fantasy show with dragons and boobs? They said, what's the next Game of Thrones?
Right.
And the next Game of Thrones was Succession.
Right, exactly.
So who's the big name that they pull in for House of the Dragon, which is more of an anthology, time-jumpy period piece? Matt Smith from The Crown.
Smart.
That's the kind of poignant elevator pitch influence that they're pulling into House of the Dragon.
Sure, yeah.
I love that.
Yeah, and Succession is a lot like The Crown. Again, it's which is like Game of Thrones. It's these intense family dynamics, and maybe Succession's a lot more cynical than The Crown, for example. Yeah. But there's a lot of crossover, and it doesn't. Yeah. It's a much shorter amount of time, but it's big time, powerful family dynasty. Who gets what? Who has influence over who? It's professional arguments mixed in with personal ones because they're so intertwined because of the way that their careers are. Like it's all
politicking.
It's all there. So you get a lot of that.
It was interesting. You can tell kind of at these press junkets that they sort of have to play to their audience, right? Not everyone who's watching San Diego Comic-Con coverage has seen The Crown, right? It's just not. It's not like a genre, Star Warsy kind
There's not as much crossover. Yeah.
So everyone who was there knew Matt Smith primarily from Doctor Who. And he was saying, I've done that. I did that for a long time. I wanted to sign up for something that was a really different, mischievous kind of piece of shit role.
Yeah. Versus like this goofy, sweet, doctor.
Yeah, which makes sense. But also, having seen his fantastic work in The Crown.
Yeah. I mean,
he made him a piece of shit. I mean, he did such a good job because that character is a dirtbag.
Yeah, and he looked great in that. Cam, don't speak ill of the dead. No, but he was great in the trailer. Like he looked. I mean, he probably only got a collective 20 seconds on screen, but he looked great. I thought his weird lack of eyebrows worked really well with his blonde hair, and he just looks really menacing and complicated and kind of sympathetic, but also kind of icky the way that all Game of Thrones characters are. Yeah, so he looked amazing. And the two women playing Princess, I wrote her name down, Rhaenyra, whatever.
We're going to figure out next month.
We're going to figure it out. It's at first I didn't realize it was taking place over so much time, and that they had cast 2 actresses, because I was like, I watched the trailer probably 5 or 6 times. I was like, is that the same actress? I don't think it is. And I was very confused. And then I realized it's the same character, just over time. But they both look really great.
Cool.
They look really interesting and not like they're trying to be Dany, which I think is great. I mean, I don't know. I'm sure that'll be more apparent when the show comes out. But I didn't look at that and see a carbon copy of Daenerys, which is hard to do when all of your Targaryens have to be blonde.
I think it's funny that the secret sauce to Game of Thrones, and I think we've learned this plenty of times in our lifetime, the secret sauce to these big franchises is middle-aged, stage-trained British actors.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the heart and soul of Game of Thrones.
Yeah.
You think of Varys and Littlefinger. That's the engine that moves this car.
And Tyrion.
And there's a lot of that in Harry Potter. There's a lot of, I mean, look at having Hugo Weaving as Elrond.
Yeah.
Look at having Aragorn and
Ian McKellen. Yeah.
Those are the guys that put the thing over.
Yeah.
And it can, I mean, you can throw Cate Blanchett into that role. I mean, there are tons of people, but I think that's the engine. It's those stage-trained middle-aged actors. And I loved, just from what I've seen of the cast members, not even in costume or anything, it looks like they've got that same caliber of person.
Yeah.
Paddy Constantine, I believe is the name.
Yes,
he's King Viserys, the guy who George compared to King Lear.
Yeah.
I've seen him in like bit parts, and he's fantastic.
Yeah.
And he's the kind of guy I was always like, I want to see more of him. Which is exactly how I felt with the actor who plays Kendall in Succession. Because I saw him in these bit parts. Good. He had a bit part in The Big Short, and I was like, I want more of this. And now he's just stacking Emmys.
Yeah.
Also, Rhys Ifans.
I was about to say, I couldn't remember how to say his name. I was looking him up. He's in this too. He looks.
Was another one of those.
He's the Hand of the King.
Right, and he was kind of a small player in Harry Potter, but with such potential.
Yeah.
And kind of authority.
Yes.
Yeah. So I'm excited because the trick, like one of the recent Marvel movies, one of the after credit little surprises for babies was they pulled out Harry Styles and they're like, he's going to be a new bad guy. But that's not the thing that makes franchises killers. No. It's the skeeving, conniving, middle-aged British actors. Yeah. That's what you need. That's why Peaky Blinders is good. Because it's Peaky Blinders, it's Cillian Murphy and a bunch of mischievous middle-aged people. That's the trick.
That's it. Yeah.
And I feel like looking at the real, teen years prequel nature of Rings of Power, where it's really, cusp of adulthood sort of looking people with young, sweepy hair.
Yes, it's like all your favorite characters, but young adult.
And they all have the same, like, short, floofed hair.
Yeah.
And then seeing all the Targaryen look.
Yeah.
And knowing that it's just going to be the daggers and the blood and all the Macbeth shit I love.
Yeah.
That's where my heart is.
Yes.
So I couldn't be more excited.
No, I'm really
to watch
excited.
this show because I mean, I remember the little phone calls of talking to you and talking to Tristan every week when Game of Thrones was on. And I'm so excited just to have that back in my life.
I know. I feel like I haven't, since Game of Thrones, I haven't had something to watch that I'm like this invested in. The closest thing is Outlander, but that fell off in season like 3 or 4, and so I just kind of
there was some turnover behind the scenes.
And so it just it didn't hold up the way that, I mean, even though Game of Thrones kind of fell off at the end, I was still so invested, and I can't wait to be this invested in the show again.
Almost more excited about this
than
Game of Thrones.
Interesting.
Because I get all of those feelings. I get that community.
you have the built-in nostalgia and love for it that you had for 10 years.
But it's also the listeners. I'm excited for the emails the comments,
very excited.
The Instagram and TikTok and Twitter or email or whatever you want.
Because when we were watching Game of Thrones, we weren't doing this, It was just us and the few people we knew who watched it.
And we were listening to inferior Game of Thrones podcasts at the time. And so I'm excited to do those Tuesday episodes, and I'm excited for you guys to participate, and it's just going to be a fun 10 weeks.
We are going to watch Rings of Power. I don't think we're going to really talk about it on the show. There might be other ways we engage with it, but
we've got some plans.
Yeah, but we are going to watch it. It's not like we're just vetoing it, because again, I do want it to be good.
Of course,
but we don't.
And we've never said anything to the contrary.
Yeah, I don't think we're going to cover it on the show though, unless it blows us away. But I doubt.
Also, if you spend a year and a half doing a close reading of a book, being frustrated that the thing is then breaking the lore, like that an adaptation isn't really following source material. Yeah. I don't think our reaction is crazy.
I agree.
You know?
Yeah.
So we've got some announcements coming soon that should be fun, kind of future of the pod stuff. And we will see you on Friday for the next chapter of The Witcher, which is fantastic.
Really
Blood of Elves,
good.
that's chapter 5, which again blew me away. Sapkowski does not miss.
No, he's a good boy.
Then we'll be back next Tuesday. Here, let's give you some time. So on Netflix, we're doing a horror movie called Hush.
Yes,
that was made by Netflix.
Yes, and this was a listener suggestion. And we recorded this episode a while back, so we might say some things that seem out of sync with what's going on, but it's really good.
It's like a riff on the masked slasher thing. It's a riff on the home invasion. It's got a bunch of fun elements, small cast. I really enjoyed watching that movie and doing that episode.
Yeah, it's also not super, super scary. So if you're kind of afraid of horror movies, you could watch this one and then listen to our thoughts.
Haunting of Hill House, if you've seen Dr. Sleep, or Midnight Mass or Blind Manor, any of the Flanagan stuff, this is an early kind of pivotal work in his career.
Yeah.
So
go
check that out, and we'll see you on Tuesday and Friday and
all the things.
Again and again and again until we get to House of the Dragon.
Yep.
Oh, I'm so excited.
All right.
Cool.
Don't talk to your grandmother's scary dog. I don't recommend it.
No.
Okay.
Dogs are on my shit list. secondbreakfastpod@gmail.com, Instagram, TikTok. We'll see you in 3 days.
Maybe we should just get a dragon. I think that would be safer.
Or 3.
There you go. What about 17? 17 dragons. They'll fit in our apartment.
All hatching at the same time.
Oh my gosh.
Well, we have a balcony. It's fine.
Hagrid would go ballistic. Can you imagine 17 dragons? He'd lose his mind.
He knows his mummy.
All right. Toodaloo.
Bye.